On China, if the U.S., if India and China were to go to war with one another, which Indians think about all the time, we have a $500 billion trade relationship with China. We have a $100 billion trade relationship with India. And China holds a lot of our debt. And the Indians say, we go to war with China? Who are you going to back? But the other great one that was put to me, and I didn't have an answer for, in every meeting that I have with Indians, there's always a question I don't have an answer for. And this was probably the hardest. We did a preemptive strike to get Osama bin Laden. We violated Pakistani sovereignty, flew in, took him out, and got out of the country. This was somebody that perpetrated an act of terror against the United States, and the Pakistanis weren't prosecuting him. He was operating right under their nose, probably with the complicity of their military, or at least their intelligence services. India's had an attack from Pakistan. If India found out the perpetrator of that attack and flew in with their own stealth helicopters and violated Pakistani sovereignty and took out those people and got out, that could precipitate a war. Would the United States back India in that context? Would we allow that attack to happen? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, and you wonder, given the chaotic, incoherent nature of American foreign policy in many respects in the last few years, whether we have the means to arrive at an answer to that, other than just what gets decided that day by whoever happens to be the president. I mean, it reminds me as well, this whole larger question of how these relationships are built and the general impatience of American foreign policy now in the American public. It made such an impression on me right after the war in Afghanistan, the first part of things, right after 9/11, and when Pakistan was in fact an incredibly important ally. Couldn't have been done really what was pulled off in terms of breaking down the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, putting Al-Qaeda on the run. But then immediately after that, the tariff exemption that Pakistan enjoyed on its textiles, and in particular men's shirts in the United States, was coming up for renewal. And Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina sort of stood up in the Senate and said, you know, we can't allow this exemption of the tariffs. It might take away jobs at textile mills in North Carolina. Mostly textile mills that didn't exist anymore. It was just a habit. We had to stop it. And so right after this country is our ally in this incredibly important initiative to bring justice to the victims of 9/11, we turn around and on a pretty petty trade concern. I don't think I've ever worn a Pakistani-made men's shirt, but on an incredibly petty concern, we're unwilling to extend this fairly obvious kind of benefit to someone who's been our ally. And it would seem that in India we have those kinds of challenges and how you have to make the right choice a large majority of the time over a really long period of time to build the kind of relationship that the president's actually envisioning here. I mean, is that something we can pull off? Are we capable of that anymore?
Well, I mean, I have to say, I think the answer is yes. And I think big moves in foreign policy are still possible. And, you know, Obama's being in India is part of a big move in foreign policy, right? So for Obama, the Indian relationship is very attractive because it underscores what might be his signature foreign policy initiative, and that's the pivot or rebalance to Asia, where he was trying to refocus the attention of the country away from the Middle East towards a much bigger game and challenge, and that is the challenge in Asia, the challenge of a rising and increasingly assertive China, and how one sets up a structure in Asia that both offsets Chinese, any tendency towards Chinese expansionism, but also embraces China, right? Because you don't want conflict, you don't want a war, you don't want a Cold War. You want to engage China and bring it into a system of rules and responsibilities and relationships that works for everyone. So his move was to say, let's do that. A variety of initiatives involving Japan, Australia, but India's at the other side of China, right? So you want India involved in that as well. And that initiative has set up something that from the Chinese perspective is perhaps overly containment style, but the aim and goal of the policy is certainly to embrace China as much as offset its influence in terms of domination of Asia.
We're about to, embark on our quadrennial hunger game in the United States. That is the search for the next president of the United States. And what's really fascinating about that is in the core mainstream of both political parties, there is a bipartisan embrace of seeing India in exactly the context that Jeff laid out.
But the ultimate success of it is going to depend obviously on what happens in India as well, but also China. It's going to be a complicated mix of cooperation and contention among